am out in the woods in search of pine resin, and I want to find like a really good spot, which means I have to spend a little bit of time looking. Pine resin is one of my favorite things to harvest in the forest because it can be somewhat hard to find. It's really awesomely useful, and it's like a pretty sustainable resource as long as you're not picking it out of the tree wound. So we're gonna look for Douglas fir resin, which is usually my favorite. Maybe we'll find some ponderosa pine resin on the way. But let's get going and find a good tree. One of the reasons I love pine resin so much is that it is an amazing wound healer. And pretty much anytime I get a cut or a scratch, or even have like a breakout on my face, I use pine resin salve on it. I use it, like I bring it when I travel every single time in my toiletries kit, because it's like nature's antibiotic ointment. It's amazing. Makes the wound heal faster, prevents infection. I've even used it on like cat scratches and stuff. Works fantastically on that. So I think you're really gonna love it, and it's pretty easy to make. Little tip from future Natalie, we were actually going to be making pine resin salve from the pine resin we find, so stick around for the second half of the video. As you can see, we have a lot of trees to look at to see if they have resin. A lot of choices. One of these trees has to have something on it. Y'all, I might have just found it. Check this out. Oh yeah, it's gonna be it. What we have here is actually pine resin, not pine sap. And this is a healing substance that the tree uses to heal its wounds. And this on the trunk is actually all just dripping down from the wound, and the tree doesn't need it anymore because it's dripped out of the wound. Here is actually a successfully healed tree wound with some of the resin still left. And the bark is actually closed up in the middle to close up on the wound that was there, which I think is just so beautiful. Here is just an absolutely amazing example of pine resin doing a great job completely covering the inner part of the tree here. We're definitely not going to harvest any of this resin because the tree is using all of it. And I bet you that that's going to heal up just like that other wound that we saw. Beautiful. Now this here's a Douglas fir tree. Douglas fir resin is my favorite. These are Douglas fir needles, and they make kind of a bottle brush formation on the branch. Douglas fir resin usually looks like this on the tree. It kind of runs down like a waterfall. And here are the cones, which have little kind of bracts in between the scales. Ponderosa pine, on the other hand, has these really, really long needles and these really large scaly cones. And be careful because the cones actually have little prickles in them on the ends of the scales. Ponderosa pine bark is also really unique. It has these puzzle pieces that pop off if you pull them a little bit, and they kind of end up forming these really beautiful layers. And it's also a little bit red. I like Douglas fir resin just because it's a lot easier to harvest off the tree because it does a lot more dripping, whereas ponderosa pine tends to form globules and it's harder to tell if it's in a wound or not, which is kind of confusing. Ponderosa pine resin also tends to be a little bit more dirty, whereas Douglas fir resin, because of the way that it drips down the tree, tends to be a lot easier and cleaner, and it has less bugs in it and less dirt and weird other things. So this tends to be my preference. Now, it's really important to remember, do not pick out of the wound. And there are various sizes and types of tree wounds. It may look like the stuff around the corners of a wound the tree isn't using, but you don't want to pick that either. So we're looking at stuff that has dripped down out of a wound, like it has on this tree, and we're gonna pick it off little by little into our bag and bring it home to make medicine with. So let's get out our parchment paper bag because it does not stick to parchment. It does stick to fingers, by the way. So as we're harvesting it, we're gonna try not to get too much on our fingers. I'm harvesting on a really cold morning because the resin is actually a lot harder and less sticky in the cold weather. So this is a great thing to harvest in the fall or winter. Let's get to harvesting. I have my little parchment paper bag. I already have some resin pieces in it from earlier, and we're just gonna use my fingers. I like to hold my bag underneath where I'm picking because often they're so dry you can knock them off on accident. So you can catch the pieces that you knock off. And certain patches can be easier to harvest from than others just because of like how big the drips are and how thick the drips are and stuff like that. So what I really find is a nice method is finding several different trees to harvest from throughout the day, so that you are kind of finding a little bit on this tree, and a little bit on this tree, and then there's not so much pressure to just find like a giant resin deposit. And like a lot of these trees in the forest have a little bit of resin, so you can kind of just go shopping around. Finding some good ones. Definitely finding a couple of ants stuck in the resin, which is really cool. That's kind of basically what happened in Jurassic Park, is that this turns into amber, which becomes kind of more like a mineral eventually. So yes, pine resin is an amazing preservative, and it lasts for years. It's really amazing. And so these ants may be found by people thousands of years, millions of years, maybe even from now. Kind of cool to think about. Maybe they'll find my DNA in it too. Leave a hair behind. They'll clone me in 2020. Sorry, 2020. That's not the future anymore. They'll clone me in the year 4000. It'll be great. We are back at home, and we are going to put 1 cup of olive oil into our jar. And we are going to put that jar in some cold water in a pan, because jars often break if you just put them in hot water immediately. So I'm going to start cold, and we'll probably turn it up about halfway, I would say. And then we're going to put our pine resin in. So we've got 1/2 cup of oil in here so far. Now, normally I don't measure the resin at all, but since we are doing this video and you might want to know, I am going to put 1 ounce of resin into my oil. And you can actually see that I have a mix of ponderosa pine globules in here and some of the more tear-shaped Douglas fir resin globules in here. So we are going to end up with a little bit of dirt at the bottom, which will be fine. I'll show you what to do with it. Tally-ho! All right, it's going to take a while for this to heat up enough for that resin to melt, so we're going to stir it a little bit, but probably not until this starts to simmer. All right, my water is now boiling, and I've got my chopstick, and I can feel the resin. It's starting to get soft, which is definitely what I want, and it is starting to dissolve a little bit. Oh yeah, you can see that the oil is starting to get cloudy, and this big globule is going to take a while to dissolve, which is actually why the big globules aren't necessarily better. The smaller bits are easier to dissolve in the oil. We're just going to keep stirring, and now to make this a salve, we're going to need to add some beeswax, and I really love these beeswax pastilles because they melt so wonderfully in there. I have measured out 0.65 ounces of beeswax pastilles, which is 20 grams of them. So we're going to go ahead and pour them in our solution, and we're also going to melt these, which these should melt quicker now that it's nice and hot. And give it a little stir for a while. All right, while that is melting, I went ahead and set up my little salve tins. These are little 1/2 ounce metal tins that I got on Amazon, and I like the really small size because they're really portable and I can give a lot to friends. Awesome, it looks like everything is nice and melted in here. It's a little bit cloudy, and there's a couple of little pieces of tree bark floating in here. I'm hoping that we can kind of pick those out as we go. Most of the yucky stuff, the stuff that didn't melt into the oil, is on the bottom, and so we'll just kind of stop pouring once we get to that. Let's see if I can do this without spilling. That's mainly why I have the paper towel underneath there. I always put something underneath my pouring job. See? Sometimes I use something with a lip on it, like a little glass cup measure, but other times I don't feel like washing it out because resin is super sticky and hard to wash out of whatever you put it in, so I like to keep it to 1 jar if possible. And I like to fill them up right to the brim like that, but not too full. And they will harden probably in 30 minutes to an hour just by themselves here. You could put it in the fridge, but I don't recommend disturbing them once you've poured like this. Otherwise, it can get on the caps and pour off the thing. So really just best to leave them alone once you've poured them if possible. All right, those are looking pretty good. It looks like I've got some extras, so I'm gonna put some extra tins out and pour those as well. As you can see, I'm left with a little bit of this crusty stuff in the bottom that didn't want to go into the solution, which is typical. And we're just gonna throw that away. And if you have any extra oil, you can keep that. And it actually has a pretty long shelf life because pine resin is such a great preservative. I was able to make 12 of these 1/2 ounce pine resin salves, and I'm gonna give a lot of them away as gifts. And if you do that, just make sure to label what they're for. You can write antibiotic ointment if you'd like, because a lot of people don't just know what to use it for, and they might forget if you tell them. So label it well, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. If you're looking for more information about the medicinal uses of conifers and some other information about species that grow in the Pacific Northwest, you can look in my book. There's a section on pine, but there's also sections on Douglas fir, spruce, and fir. So check that out if you'd like some really good identifying photos and maybe some more recipe ideas.